Where is Etain? I've ordered her to abort extraction and get out of there.
Sir, receiving signal from General Etain.
Play it back.
MRU. Already committed. Signal end, sir.
The wind chill factor in the open troop bay of an LAATC gunship flying at 500 kilometers per hour was sobering. But then so was the deafening roar of air and the swoops and dips of the flight path as the pilot jinked to stop ground-based AA fire from getting a lock. Etain realized why the trooper's sealed armor and bodysuit was a good idea. She had only her Jedi robes and the sensible precaution of upper body armor plates, which did little to insulate on their own. She summoned the Force to help her withstand the icy blast and made sure her safety line was hooked securely to the bulkhead rail.
You're going to be in the Dwang when you get back to HQ, General,
the clone trooper sergeant said with a grin. He slipped on his helmet and sealed it. His nickname was Clanky. She'd made a point of asking. I really did not see the signal. Or at least I looked at it a little too late.
It was very funny, signaling MRU.
Funny? Oh. There was a frozen pause before he explained.
It's how you decline a social invitation. An RPC. Request the pleasure of your company. MRU. Much regret, unable.
Oh yes, she was in the Dwang indeed, as he put it. She wasn't fully up to speed with the massive acronyms and slang that had erupted in the last year. She could hardly keep up with the clone troopers' inventiveness, their extraordinary capacity to appropriate language and habits and shape them to their needs had spawned subcultures of clone identity everywhere. She almost felt like she needed a protocol droid. MRU indeed. How could I be so stupid? So the troopers thought she was a smart mouth like Phi, flourishing a little bravado. Instead, she was simply ignorant of the rapidly evolving and idiosyncratic jargon, and used it carelessly. I'm sure they'll forgive me if you pull this off, Sergeant. Her voice was slowly being drowned out by the roar and falling note of V-19 torrent drives as two of the fighters shrieked past them and disappeared into the distance. They were heading off to soften the droid positions that stood between the heavily forested terrain where both Sarlacc battalions were pinned down, and there was a narrow ribbon of delta shoreline where pilots could land. Droids, as Darman had once pointed out, were rubbish in dense forests. Etain hoped so. The gunship dropped suddenly, now level with the tree canopy, and the streaked image of green foliage showed her just how fast they were flying. Another Lardy came up on their port side. There were 34 gunships somewhere near, strung out in loose formation heading for the extraction zone.
3 minutes, General,
came the voice from the pilot's cockpit intercom. There was a crack and flare of something exploding off to their starboard side.
Getting some attention from the Tinnies AAA, so we'll drop a little more. Hold tight.
The barrage of explosions hardly made her even flinch now. She had reached the saturation level of adrenaline where she was vividly aware of every hazard, but running on some primeval automatic level of painless, cold reason. Too scared to panic, as one of the clone troopers had described it. 3 minutes became 3 hours, became 3 seconds. Red blaster fire from droids lit up the tree line as the Lardy banked to come around in a spiral descent. Etain didn't think, and she didn't feel, and she simply jumped the last 10 meters from the open deck over fast-roping 4-man squad of clone troopers and the green-trimmed sergeant. Force skills came in very useful at the most unlikely times. She landed in front of the squad and brought the conch rifle up level, one hand on the stock, the other on the barrel grip, to sweep the forest edge in front of her. She felt the other gunships landing all around them, whipping up soil and leaves, but she saw only what was in front. About 2 platoons of Sarlacc men exchanging fire with super battle droids on the edge of the clearing, and her squad to either side of her. A spread of 10 EMP grenades from the squad and a volley from her conch brought half the super battle droids to a halt. It was at times like this that she longed for the calming convenience of a helmet instead of one strapped to her arm in just the wrong place. The Force was short on specifics, like
SPD strength, 100 units closing up at green 20.
And there was so much chaos and pain in the Force right then that she couldn't harness it to focus. So she did what she had been drilled to do without thinking since she was 4 years old. She fought. She ran, the squad matching her pace and firing a blue stream into the droid line in odd silence until Clanky activated his voice projector and she heard him say,
They're closing up all along the shoreline. Sorry, General. Big holes now in the droid lines.
No link, she said, superfluous words stripped from her mind. The concussion rifle was getting heavy and running out of charge. The power indicator was edging back down to 0. 2 more volleys knocked 3 SPDs flat and a small tree with them. How many more?
Forward air control says 200 SPDs and tanks bearing 20 degrees with 4 torrents on their case.
More V-19s screamed low overhead, and a yellow-fringed ball of white fire backlit the forest, suddenly throwing silhouetted trees and running men into sharp contrast. Fearless's air group commander certainly had a grip on the reality of the situation. No wonder everybody loved pilots. Clanky dropped flat and began firing prone at the stream of super battle droids that had turned toward the gunship landing area. Etain followed him without thinking. He was listening to data in his helmet, judging by his occasional emphatic nod.
Sarlacc's breaking out all along the shoreline, General, and Fearless is directing the rest of the Lardies north.
Any word on General Vasca? Clanky went silent for a moment, to her at least, as he listened.
1 click north with Commander Gree. Calling in airstrikes.
2 gunships moved in close enough to catch Etain's peripheral vision, and knots of men broke from the trees, some carrying wounded comrades between them. Etain hoped the single MI6 medical droid on each Lardy could handle the triage of dozens of men at once. 1 gunship set down again at right angles to the tree line, its starboard hatch shut tight and taking droid fire that scattered sparks while it trained composite beam lasers on the super battle droids. The starboard gunner, horribly exposed in the transparent steel bubble set in the wing, was hosing the droids at waist height. Etain saw movement in white armored shapes race behind the vessel and disappear, presumably into the port side of the troop bay. The torrent of comp beam laser was like a freeze frame in its unbroken, steady stream. For a slow motion moment, Etain reasoned. Using the forward cannon and deploying the heavier and nasty armaments, radiation burst missiles would cause heavy troop casualties in this position. Her mouth was dry, her heart pounding so fast that she could hardly distinguish between beats, and yet she could stop the chrono to think these things. She resumed firing. She held her fingers tight on the trigger until the conch died in her hands.
"Oh, Tinnie's breaking this way!"
Her focus narrowed. She no longer saw the 5 men around her except as white blurs and vortices of raw energy in the force. The lead battle droid overran their position, and she simply swung the dead rifle in a force-driven arc right up into the thing's chest, smashing the alloy and sending the droid's sunken head assembly flying into the air. She was suddenly aware of blue energy behind the next droid like a continuous backdrop, although it had to be interrupted bursts of DC-15 fire. She let the conch rifle drop and drew her lightsaber because she had nothing else left. The blade of blue light sprang into life, and she didn't recall touching the control at all. She swept her arm around in a clean arc that brought the mountain of metal down without its legs, tipping like a felled tree to one side of her, falling flat on its firing arm and shuddering as its own discharging weapon tore it apart. Hot shrapnel sizzles on her robes and skin, but she felt nothing, and she was on her feet now, lightsaber gripped in both hands, point blank with the next droid. She saw 2 of her squad blasting away from a prone position, while Clanky scrambled to one knee to fire a grenade into the advancing rank of a dozen super battle droids. The droids kept advancing, so did clone troopers, and so did she. We're all the same. None of us is thinking, we're just reacting. She fended off a barrage of red fire, whirling and flicking the lightsaber without conscious decision. Each snaz of colliding energy was the first and last. She went on and on and on, blocking each shot as if it would never end, and the next droid was upon her. She slashed. Cables and alloy fragments showered her. A white gauntleted fist grabbed her shoulder and pulled her bodily out of the way.
"It's time to bang out, General! The Lardy's ready to lift!"
Clanky almost had to drag her off the pile of shattered battle droids and shove her into a run towards the gunship.
"We've done all we can here, and the bay's full! Go! Run!"
She grabbed the conch rifle as she ran back, retracing their line of advance, blind on adrenaline. But at the gunship's platform, she still stopped dead, 1 foot on the edge of the rail, to look back and count men passing her. 1, 2, 3, 4 troopers, and Clanky, all accounted for. She sprang up just as an armored hand gripped hers and yanked her inboard. She had no idea who the trooper was, but he was one of hers now. The gunship lifted in a straight vertical, so fast that her stomach plummeted back to ground level. The forest and fertile delta plain of Dinlo shrank beneath the ship and grew dark. The bay hatches slid forward and slammed shut. Then she was standing in a warehouse of scorched, filthy armor, and the stench of blood and seared flesh. Her primeval survival mechanisms yielded to shaking anticlimax. Clanky pulled off his helmet and their eyes met, an odd moment that was almost a glance in the mirror. She knew that the unblinking wide-eyed shock on his face was exactly what he was seeing on hers. Instinctively, they both reached out to clasp forearms, and their grips locked for a second or two. Clanky was also shaking. Then they parted and turned away. It was synchronous. Yes, we're just the same. All of us, Etain thought. It was very, very quiet when she blocked out the thrum of the gunship's drives as it made 660 kilometers per hour off the dial, back to the Fearless. And no, the Mi-6 droid could not deal with 40 men crammed into a modified bay better suited to 30, not if a quarter of them were injured. Then, when Etain listened more carefully and her adrenaline had ebbed, she realized the bay wasn't as quiet as she had thought. There was ragged breathing and stifled yelps of pain, and the worst, incoherent whimpering that peaked to a crescendo of a single stifled scream and trailed off again. She picked her way across the bay, stepping over men who were crouching or kneeling. Propped against the bulkhead, a clone trooper was being held in a sitting position by his brother. His helmet and chestplate were removed, and Etain needed no med-droid to provide a prognosis for a chest wound that was producing blood on the lips. Medic! Medic, get this man some help now! She said, whipping around. Med-droid appeared as if from nowhere, jerking bolt upright from a knot of troopers where it was obviously working. Its twin photoreceptors trained on her. General, why is this man not being attended to?
Triage X,
the droid said, dropping down into an unbroken carpet of troopers again to resume its first aid. Etain should have known. The red X symbol glowed on his shoulder. She hoped the man hadn't heard, but he probably knew anyway, because that was the unsentimental way the Kaminoans had presented their training to the clones. Triage X, too badly injured, not expected to survive despite intervention. Concentrate resources on Code 3, then Code 5. She took a breath and reminded herself that she was a Jedi, and there was more to being a Jedi than wielding a lightsaber. She knelt down beside him and grabbed his hand. The grip he returned was surprisingly strong for a dying man. It's okay, she whispered. She reached out in the Force to get some sense of the injury, to shape it in her mind, hoping to slow the hemorrhage and hold shattered tissue together until the Lardy docked. But she knew as soon as she formed the scale of the damage in her mind that it wouldn't save him. She had vowed never again to use mind influence on clones without their consent. She had eased Atain's grief and given Niner confidence when he needed it most, both unasked for. But since then she had avoided it. Clones weren't weak-minded anyway, whatever people thought. But this man was dying, and he needed help. I'm Etain, she said. She concentrated on his eyes, seeing behind them somehow into a swirl of no color at all, and visualized calm. She held out her hand to the trooper, supporting his shoulders and mouthing medpacks at him. She knew they carried single-use syringes of powerful painkiller. Darman had used them in front of her more than once. There's nothing to be afraid of. What's your nickname? Phi, he said, and it shocked her briefly. But there were many men called Phi in an army with numbers for names. His brothers said no silently and held up spent syringes. They'd already pumped him full of what little they had. Thank you, ma'am. If she could influence thought, she could influence endorphin systems. She put every scrap of her will into it. The pain's going, the drug's working. Can you feel it? If the Force had any validity, it had to come to her aid now. She studied his face, and his jaw muscles were relaxing a little. How's that? Better. Thanks, ma'am. You hang on tight. You might feel a bit sleepy. His grip was still tight. She squeezed back, and she wondered if he knew she was lying, and just chose to believe the lie for his own comfort. He didn't say anything else, but he didn't scream again, and his face looked peaceful. She rested his head on her shoulder, one hand between his head and the bulkhead, the other still clutching his, and held that position for 10 minutes, concentrating on an image of a cool, pale void. Then he started a choking cough. His brother took his other hand, and Phi, a painful reminder of a friend she hadn't seen for months and might never see again, said, I'm fine. His grip went slack. Etain was aware in a detached way of spending the next 20 minutes talking to every single trooper in that bay, asking their names, asking who has been lost, and wondering why they stared first at her chest, and then at her face, apparently bewildered. She put her hand to her cheek. It stung. She brushed it, and a fragment of alloy came away on her hand with a fresh, bright blood. She hadn't felt the shrapnel until then. She aimed herself towards a familiar patch of green in the forest of grimy white armor. Clanky. Clanky. I never asked. Where do we bury our men? Or do we cremate them like Jedi?
Neither usually, General. Don't you worry about that now.
She looked down at her beige robe and noticed that it was way beyond filthy. It was peppered with burns as if she'd been welding carelessly, and there was a ragged oval patch of deep red blood from her right shoulder down to her belt, already drying into a deep black stain. Master Kamas is going to fry me.
He can fry us too then.
Etain knew she'd think about that deftly evaded answer to her question sometime, but right then, her mind was elsewhere. She thought of Darman, suddenly conscious that something was wrong. But something was always wrong for commandos on missions, and the Force was clear that Darman was still alive. But the other Phi, the trooper, wasn't. Etain felt shamed of her personal fears and went in search of men that she could still help.